There is a shift. And a lot of people also believe that what they call the veil between life and death is really gets thinner and thinner for these people who are dying, and they can see through it. It's some level of their being can see through it, and they can see these ancestors. And my question is, in what form are they seeing them?
This is the Bounce Back Generation podcast. Today we're going to speak with Susan Oppie. Gentle trigger warning here. This podcast subject today is about death and dying and the grieving process that we go through when a loved one is gone. Susan is an advocate for bringing back the ancient traditions of honoring our deceased loved ones through ritual and providing after-death care to our dead. She believes that such reconnections with our final rite of passage are not only our inalienable rights as human beings, but can also benefit the grieving process in beautiful, healing, and even transformative ways. She's the founder of One Washcloth, a nonprofit dedicated to guiding people through the experience of death and dying of a loved one. We've known you for quite a while, for a few months. You've been volunteering with Bounce Back Generation and sharing your knowledge and your insights into the death and grieving process. So thank you. And also joining us today is Nasser Albakal, and he's our blogger at Bounce Back Generation. And Nasser, I want you to just say hi to everybody and share a little bit of your insight. We're going to be talking about death. We're going to be talking about grieving, and it's a heavy subject. I know at first when we started thinking about doing this podcast, you pulled back a little bit. Do you want to talk about what your feelings were then and what brought you around to saying, hey, yeah, I think I want to participate in this?
I want to say for topics like this, it all started with Susan introducing me to One Washcloth and the work she does there, and the conversations that she's had surrounding death really changed the way that I view it. It went from something scary and unknown to something that's just another part in our long lives. It's from something that is a little bit more confusing than other things to be very simple, and that it's just when we move on to a different realm, and for different people that can be anything religious or spiritual, but what it really is just us transitioning, and all that just makes it a lot simpler to understand, less scary. So it all is really thanks to Susan that helped me feel less apprehensive, more comfortable at talking and eventually writing and now speaking about this type of subject.
Yeah. Thank you, Nasser. Like I said, I think a lot of people have that kind of feeling, Susan, that they don't want to talk about death. They don't want to face it. They don't want to think about it. What actually got you into this world?
Long story short, I became a nurse almost 25 years ago, registered nurse almost 25 years ago, because I wanted to travel and see the world. That really was my primary reason for becoming a nurse. And instead, it turned into this journey into something I would never have foreseen. But one thing that struck me early in my career is just how disconnected from death we are, whether it was in hospitals where the protocol was to clear the bed once a person has died and get the bed ready for the next person, or like even in home health. Before I was a nurse, I was a home health aide, and the family was really wanting to call the funeral home pretty quickly. I noticed back then, and I didn't really even know what the rules were or anything, but it tapped into something deep in me, especially I can see this in retrospect, that it was confusing, that I'd been around some dying and death before all that, but it really became a part of my career really early on. And so I just did my own thing to hopefully take care of myself as best I could. I really, again, wasn't clear on how deep this situation was going into me. But like a year into my nursing career, I was advised by a counselor to maybe, clearly there's grief and stress building up in you. Why don't you try to find a creative outlet to get that energy out, because it's not doing you any good. And if you could express it in a way that somehow was cathartic or therapeutic to you, then that would be a great benefit. And that's what I did. I ended up exploring art options and how I can really work, use art to help me with the grieving and the stress that I was going through.
So were you feeling the grief of the patients and their families? Were you taking that on, or were you also bringing up your own past grief as well?
Probably a lot of both, but in addition, sometimes patients in hospitals are there for months. We're grieving too, but sometimes patients are in there just overnight. And there's a whole lot of layers of grief and how everybody grieves. I think of emergency room people who just, they maybe see that person for 20 minutes and they put their best effort into saving that person. That's grief. There's grief when you can't do what you've been trained to do. And so on all those levels, but yes, definitely there's a vicarious kind of grief. A lot of stuff passes from energies of people in a room, and there's a lot of emotion going on at these times, and so it's all that mixed up together. And if and I wasn't a very good practitioner of processing my feelings back then, and I think I'm more of an empath, and so it just gets built up if you're not careful. And yeah, personal stuff, even medical stuff I was going through at that time, it was a big time in my life as I got into the nursing profession.
It sounds like what you've noticed is that there's this kind of rush to just get through it and get it over with in a way. Actually, I have a friend whose father-in-law just died, and I was asking her yesterday how she and her husband were doing. And we had our moments, we cried, we got over it, life goes on. And this happened literally a week ago. And I said, I think that's a lot that you guys are going through. He was sick for a while and they were visiting in the hospital and all of that. And I think it's just part of our culture. And I don't know, Nasser, if you want to chime in on, I know you come from the Muslim culture, there's different rituals and different ways of handling that. And I think that's kind of what Susan's trying to tap into. Can we do something to bring ourselves back into that moment, even though it is painful and you want to be modern Americans, get over it, get on and get back to work?
I think it all depends on what that death looked like to someone. Is it a tragic death due to violent and unexpected circumstances in an accident, maybe even worse, a violent crime, or some sort of sudden illness? Or was it a slow process? It all depends. And one thing I've noticed is when people say, oh, I've gotten over, I've moved on, it's usually because they provided some sort of compassion and dignified end of life care. It was a slow process where they've had the grief early. It came, the onset of the grief was earlier, even before the passing away. And then it gives them kind of a buffer where they're able to respond in a way that is less intense, say, for them outwardly. But you never know what this person is doing it to themselves. She could be saying, your friend, we're perfectly fine, we've moved on, but they cry every night at home, or deep down inside they're broken, which is also completely fine. It's all an individual thing, and that's what makes the grieving process so hard to talk about. And that's what makes it so hard to work with people who are grieving. We all share the same emotions and the same hormones that those emotions come from. We're all different people who express those things differently and then act upon them a lot differently.
Yeah, that's well put. That's where the rituals come in, because they require us to slow down, right?
Yeah, but what Nasser said just really brought up a few different things. Is the different types of grief people are grieving, like when dementia, say, is involved. There's so many levels of grief going on there, which you're losing through that person who's getting into their dementia. And also, I was remembering how when I started getting into the memorial artwork and really researching it, one thing that struck me was back in the Victorian times in our Western culture, like late 1800s, when Queen Victoria mourned for a year, where it became like a national thing, where they were draping black scarves and the women wore black, and for a year. And in some cultures, they have whole dress codes, as we call it, the modern route, which to me just sounds like the unhealthy route. Sometimes that modern word, I'm thinking, what does that even mean? Because it sure has taken us away from some very deep and innate needs that I think we all share. And I think Nasser also hit a point. It's like, we don't know what they're doing behind their doors, because what our society has framed for us is, you got 3 days for a bereavement, or I don't know, but that's very unnatural. And I'm afraid I've forgotten your question. So what
No,
did you
you
ask?
answer the question, which is
Okay.
how does ritual help us to create
Yeah,
that space where
right.
that grieving can happen? And it's you don't have to think about it all the time. You almost walk through, like blindly walk through a process. And my father died. He's a Sikh from India, and there was very set things. And at the time, I was like, oh gosh, we have to sit for 3 days while they read the scriptures, and you have to eat certain things. But in retrospect, every step of that caused us to slow down, to be in that moment, to be like, I'm okay, everything's fine. And then you never know. Then 5 days later, remember boarding a plane and I couldn't stop crying. I was crying and crying, and I kept wiping my eyes, couldn't stop crying. And thankfully I had that. But a lot of times what I think happens in an American culture is, like you said, you get those 3 days, 5 days, whatever it is, bereavement. And then 2 months later, you're not feeling great. And
Breakdown.
somebody says, what's going on? I don't know. What happened in your life? Recently, my dad died. But you're not supposed to feel that. You're supposed to be over it by then. So talk about so you have a nonprofit called One Washcloth.
One Washcloth.
Talk
And we're
about
not
that.
officially a nonprofit. Yeah, we're not officially a nonprofit. It's been the three of us nurses who just said, let's do this. So we're basically what we call a charitable initiative. Three nurses, myself and two other RNs, met up 10 years ago now at a National Home Funeral Alliance conference. And we can get into that if you want a bit. But that's all about educating people about what their rights are regarding caring for our own dead in this country. But the three of us, Rochelle Martin, Lynn Holtzman, and I, we met up, and along with another woman, Cassandra Yonder, we're discussing how we can bring the concept of caring for our own dead like into a hospital situation where everything's so busy and chaotic so many times. So what can we bring that would be simple, non-threatening, and just something that could really help, like what we're talking about, the ritual and the process of this. Again, we're going to the final rite of passage here. This is what this is all about. This is like a once in a lifetime thing that has just happened, and we believe it's important to market. And we feel that what One Washcloth offers, and what basically it offers, is the idea of encouraging people to use a washcloth after a person has died, and whether that means they're just wiping the brow of the person or wiping the hand or whatever they can, the whole body. It allows them a whole lot. It allows them time. It gives them permission to touch the body, which so many people believe is just off limits when a death occurs. And it just allows a person to provide some sort of love, a last chance of showing that love in physical form. And I think it also helps, especially when you have a couple of days about what you were talking about with your father's death. It allows your heart to catch up with what your brain already knows. The brain has a way of going, oh, okay, they're dead. Oh gosh, I got to make phone calls. And this our system here, the whole funeral world. I know some people feel very grateful for just having to focus on a funeral, because that can take up all your time and energy right there for a week or so. But then there's delayed grief. And yeah, so that's what One Washcloth does. It brings you into this reality in a non-threatening, in a very natural way. And it's very simple, just this using a washcloth to do what you need to do, or just to participate in some way that you didn't even know you could. Our ancestors have always done prior to the 1950s. Yeah, early 1900s, our ancestors were still doing it.
Why do you think we started to separate from that? I've heard you talk a little bit about some of these macro issues that have arisen in our modern capitalist world that have caused that. Can you talk about that?
Okay, if I were to pinpoint an area, it's similar to the Victorian time I was just mentioning, but it's what's considered the second industrial revolution of this country, when industry was just starting up in all different directions, and that included the funeral industry, it included the medical industry. And so those were two parts of it. And I also put a third piece of the assimilation of our culture with people who are from other areas. I'm talking refugees, I'm talking immigrants, and I'm talking of our darker history of the enslaved situation we had for so many hundreds of years, where people were taken away or left their culture for whatever reason, or even the indigenous people here who were forced into the assimilating situations in those schools and everything. They were separated from their traditions and their cultures and nature. And so that, in combination with the modern world, modern health world, modern medical world, where people started dying away from home. There's no people, their technology was getting to a place where they're like, okay, if we could bring them in, or we have whatever, we might be able to give them some more time or whatever. But anyway, so people started dying more in homes. Also, in the late 1800s, there was a civil war in this country where the baby funeral industry was just taking form, and they may have seen their chance because they certainly latched onto it. And especially when it came to embalming bodies, that's where thousands of young men primarily were killed on battlefields in a different part of the country from where they came from, and families wanted to have those bodies back. And so that's when the embalming got a big push.
The
and
Civil
then with
War.
the Civil War, and with the death of Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. So those two events in the late 1800s really put the funeral industry on a map. And there are some interesting books about that time period. This one I had read, they talked about how early on in the Civil War, when the funeral industry was just catching hold, and they were advertising embalming on these roads where the soldiers would have to walk, as if it was going to be a comfort to the soldiers to, don't worry, whatever happens, we'll get you home. But then one of the higher ups in the Civil War were like, I think this is hurting our soldiers' morale. Can we take those down? And they took them down. But anyway,
incredibly sad to be like, that's, oh gosh.
So,
what an advertisement to see on it as you're walking into war.
But that's this
Nancy,
new industrial boost that was going on.
Yeah, I mean, well, what you said earlier, Susan, was incredible. It's something that I've actually was just researching a few days ago, on how the history of this country, of capitalism, and of white supremacy, on the profound impact that this had on how we as Americans grieve in this country. Racial discrimination, capitalism, unequal wealth distribution has led to the unequal distribution of resources, which means unequal distribution to quality of life and healthcare, which causes certain communities, usually Black and Brown, LGBTQ plus communities, to be marginalized and experience higher rates of preventable death. And this waters down death for a lot of Americans, especially those in marginalized LGBT, Black and Brown communities, where capitalism and white supremacy and this whole idea of the false notion of equality in this nation, when it is actually the exact opposite, has rapidly increased the devaluing of life in our culture and the devaluing of life in American society. And it all begins from the origins of this nation, of white supremacy and capitalism. And I'm so glad that this was brought up, because this is one of the most misunderstood and least understood points of this topic.
Amen.
It's a big topic. And you put it very well. And another thing that you keep popping these ideas in my mind, Nasser, that when you talked about the white supremacy, especially, and how when people were dying more in hospitals, and when people were feeling that they were white people, were feeling more wealthy, it's like keeping up with the Joneses, is that kind of gross, whatever that term is we use here. It's like, why, what, who cares? But it's like the same thing happened in the funeral industry, as it does with any place where people want to show that they have money. And that's when the funeral industry was starting to charge people. And people are like, yeah, let's just have them do it. It'll make people see that we've got some clout here, or we're moving up in the stratosphere. And I know and another thing you said also triggered something, because I had mentioned the home funeral movement earlier. And again, the National Home Funeral Alliance is our country's go-to, at least I feel, in educating people about what their innate and inalienable rights are as far as caring for their own. But when I first became aware of this whole option, I had no idea that we were even legally allowed to do this. It just wasn't even in my way of thinking back then when I became a nurse, that people still cared for their own at home. When I did find out about it, I just remember feeling so angry, because I worked with so many people who couldn't afford hardly to put their electricity on. and usually people of color. And this was primarily in San Antonio, Texas. And when I remember so clearly, when I was called to a home, when I was doing hospice care and going to people's homes, and we'd be called, especially when there's a death or if there's like pain that's not being managed well. And whenever I got there, I don't remember, I think it might have been a pain call, but by the time I got there, the woman had died. And I remember the husband just being really stressed. I think, anyway, and the grandchild was there, but she wanted a mariachi band at her funeral. And he was just like, we can't afford both. We can't afford a funeral and a hire a mariachi band. And it was just like, I don't know, it still brings tears to my eyes. That's the level we get here with it. And yeah, like you're saying, the white privilege and everything, it permeates everything in this country, and clearly it has for a very long time.
It's paradoxical, and to Nasser's point and to what you were just talking about, that we live in a society where we see death all the time. It's on our video games and our movies and TV shows, and like, oh yeah, I'm going to watch the murder mystery, whatever. But then when death is real, we do that separating ourselves from it. And I know that we were talking earlier, and you mentioned that you live in Oakland, and that there's a large homeless population. And there was a man who died who was homeless, and how it was like next day, sweep up his tent and who's there for him. But then a celebrity dies and we go into mourning, and we never met the celebrity, but that homeless guy is the guy you see every day when you walk into the bus or whatever.
Or you tried not to see that guy every day. You turn your head, or what, all those things that we have been, I don't know if we've been trained, but it certainly is part of how we deal with things here. And yeah, and when I go back to also the fact that we're in such denial, that's how all these video games and stuff can happen, in my opinion, wars and everything else. Any society that's in denial of such a basic truth, we're bound to never thrive. We're bound to never be healthy. So that's been my mission, is like, guys, it's going to happen. The sooner we start really being honest about it, I think our lives can improve greatly across the board. But it's complex for sure.
Unless there's an amazing discovery where no one will ever die and we will be frozen in liquid nitrogen. You're right. You're so right, Susan.
I don't understand the wanting to live forever thing. Maybe it's just me, but I'm fine with, at some point, I'm tired.
If you've been frozen for so long, what's your skin going to be like? And what are you going to be like in 4 decades? Or I don't know.
And that brings another point. What is worth living? What makes the life worth living is also what makes the death worth happening at the end. Because I'm not talking about someone losing their life early. And early is a whole subjective thing. But it seems pretty obvious what late is. If someone is 90 years old, that's a long life. We human beings, we have a life expectancy like deer do, like elephants do, like cats do, like dogs. We have one. We have a biological shelf life. We're meat and bones, just like all the other creatures of the earth. So eventually we're going to have to get society to recognize that so that they can care for it a lot. Because it seems so wild. Americans, we love animals. We'll care for animals. We'll go head over heels with protecting pandas. Animals thousands of miles away from us. But when it comes to the hundreds of millions of animals, people, us, around us, we don't care.
And I think one thing that's really, when we talk about our own death or the closeness of death to us, one thing that I find really comforting is when I hear from hospice nurses and they talk about what actually happens when you die. And that there seems to be some rhythm to it. There's a pattern to it, that people will go like the death rattle. And maybe you can talk about that. That you get the death rattle, you start to slow down, or I've heard that a lot of times, and this happened to my cousin, he's much older than me, and he was in the hospital, and he rallied one day and everyone said, oh, he's going to be fine. His heart's okay. He's going to go home in a few days. And then the next day he died. And that seems to be really common, that people were rallied. They'll see their relatives, they'll say goodbye. Or they'll see people who've passed on. My father saw people that were passed on, and he was saying, he was talking in Punjabi to them, and I'm going to see, what are you doing here? So can you talk about that? What's going on?
That is a mystery. I think it's a mystery to everybody what's going on, but it's so common. And you hear these stories, you see these things, and you're like, something's up here. But yeah, the rallying, I've wondered if it's something that's biologically set in people, that when things are shutting down, like it just everything's thrown into just giving your body one more chance. I don't know. Some people think it's just the spirit just pushing out one more time in this physical form to celebrate or to enjoy. It's a mystery, that it really is, and it doesn't happen with everybody. And one thing you were said though right away with the hospice, it's and your family member who died like that next day. People wait to get on hospice. I should have looked up the average length of stay these times on not even stay, but average length of hospice service can be sometimes as low as a week. That's for average, when they can have 6 months, and it can be what's it called, when you reviewed and then added continued if you still meet the criteria. But because of our society and our need to keep putting it off, and for what, as Nasser said, what are we putting it off for when we're really sick? And a lot of people don't even come on. And I can't tell you how many times I've either been to homes or got a person when I was working like a brick and mortar hospice building, that they would just come for a few hours and they'd be gone because they did all the treatments possible, and the family or whoever was just determined to try everything. And then, so people just don't even have a sense of what that final end of life really is, and how beautiful it can be, how hard it can be, of course. But that is what hospice is supposed to do, is help you with all the things that you can't do by yourself. But there is some really good things that can come out of it if you just know. But yeah, there are a lot of stages to dying, and again, like stages of grief, you don't see all of them. And depends on, again, what Nasser was saying, what is the situation, what type of death are we talking about? So one of the first things you see, and that can, I think, even start a month or two before the death, is that people start withdrawing. And that can be like, just don't want so many visitors. They don't want to really be talking. They may start sleeping a little more. And that is believed to be like, because there's a shift going on. We don't know what it is, but there's something is happening where the physical life is still here. And again, it's whatever your beliefs are about what is that next place. But there is a shift. And a lot of people also believe that what they call the veil between life and death gets thinner and thinner for these people who are dying, and they can see through it. It's some level of their being can see through it, and they can see these ancestors. And my question is, in what form are they seeing them? Because our ancestors, once they die, they no longer have that physical form. Our memories are getting triggered in there too, unless there's just something way beyond my scope of understanding, is that these bodies are really forming that people are actually seeing, and if that even makes any sense. But I think it's a mystery to even those who probably tried to research it, and there's no way to scan a brain of a person who's in that state or really see what's going on. But it's fascinating when it happens, and when you're like going, okay. And as a nurse, I would just go along with it, as long as it wasn't threatening or scary to a person that they were seeing these visions, or it seemed very natural. And so we go along with that, but hard to know exactly what's going on. As far as, so sleeping and that withdrawal is first, and then not even needing to eat. People just stop wanting to eat. That's another stage often. That's pretty common, because your body is shutting down. That physical part is shutting down. It no longer needs to be running errands, no longer needs to even be getting out of bed. You've been mostly sleeping all this time. And so what little energy is left shouldn't be focusing on trying to digest food that your body's not even needing, because that can really cause some complications if you're building up a lot of undigested food in your stomach. So that's another thing. And then what they call the death rattle.
What is the death rattle?
The death rattle is basically just the fact that people aren't swallowing anymore. And throughout our every day of our lives, we're producing a lot of saliva, and we're just swallowing all day long. But once you get into that state where your body is just not quite functioning, and you're lying on your back and the saliva is just collecting in the back of your throat, can be very unpleasant, unsettling for people to hear that kind of noise. And oftentimes, just by turning the head or turning the body, you'll allow the gravity to let the saliva go into the cheek. And other times, people want to get medication that's going to dry the whole body up, That can cause other discomfort. So I'm one who always go for the more natural approach and just say, let's just try repositioning your loved one here and seeing if that works. And it often does, because that really is what the death rattle is.
Well, I would think that the goal is to create a peaceful transition for the person who's dying. And then with One Washcloth and what you're talking about with the rituals, to create a pathway to grief as well, so that there's some peace for that person that is watching that process or the loved one. And one thing that's interesting that you brought up in an earlier conversation was that there's sometimes you're grieving and the person isn't necessarily a loved one. Talk about that sometimes people have to grieve for people that didn't treat them all that well.
Yeah, the way I see it, and I think it happens a lot. And again, as a hospice nurse, I have seen dysfunction comes out in families in buckets, in great large amounts when someone's dying. So you get to see a lot of stuff that's just been maybe brewing for a while. So there's a lot of situations where there was no love loss for sure. And it's going to probably be a big relief for the person who's still alive. That person is gone. And I think it's probably hard for people to say those kinds of things, but it's just true. So again, if death is a final rite of passage for this person who's dying, whether they're a loved one or not, it's also a rite of passage for you as the person who remains. And so whether that person, the deceased, is someone we're going to just be lost, feel lost for a while of having them gone, or if it's someone you're just like, oh my gosh, thank goodness. It's still, I think, an important thing to mark in your life, because it's a rite of passage. That person is no longer going to be playing the same role that they played with you before. And yeah, I'd say mark it to really say that this is a clear change, a clear moment in my life where I have a chance of doing something else with my life. Or I'm not putting that well, but I think it's a valuable enough and important enough moment in your life, whether you love that person or hated them, that you would benefit also from some ritual. And I don't mean taking care of the body even. For me, ritual is so simple. It can be so simple. And whatever speaks to you, especially if you're not someone who loved that person, what would feel good to you to be like, and it's going to be good for you. It's not about holding on to that anger or anything, whatever you feel like you can do to just release something, to move on in your life.
We want to actually ask you to share your tool, which is how to mark that milestone. And that tool that you've talked about, which I think is really cool, is using art. So talk about like the dioramas. I know that's a little bit more complicated, but there's other collages and things you can do that you don't have to hang it on your wall, but you can do that process to kind of help you.
I'm thinking, before I'll do that, I'll talk about that. But I'm just thinking, okay, if it wasn't someone you loved, I was just picturing a collage of a person again, it's for you. So I can see where a collage could even work in that situation of helping you.
Maybe you just make a closed door and you just say, I'm closing the door of that relationship now.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, I mentioned already that like a year into my nursing career, a therapist suggested that I see what I can do to creatively get this out. And so for that following year, I was really like, I puttered around in different things. I was like, I don't know what I can do. But it came to me when I got a photograph of my little nephew, and I grew up in Texas. So, Western clothing and stuff is pretty common there. But my nephew grew up in Japan. And so when he would visit, an uncle of mine would make sure he had a new little cowboy outfit to wear. I saw a photo of him just in my parents' kind of sterile front yard. And I was like, he belongs in the Wild West. So I put him into this three-dimensional Wild West scene for like his 4th birthday. And that just like, I'm like, this is it. This is what she was talking about. Because it just felt so cathartic just to put my energy somewhere else. And I just started pumping out these dioramas for friends, kids and stuff. And then at some point, I can't really remember the moment when I was like, I'd like to make one for my grandfather who had died in maybe 10 years before. I can't remember now the timeline, and I did. And then I was like, that felt really good too. Connecting with him again and just through my memory and just the moments that I just so enjoyed sharing with him. It was really a beautiful thing. And that's when I got into exploring memorial art, the history. And I call it memorial art. I don't know if that's an official term at all, but It's been going on since
Sounds
there's
good.
been human beings on the planet, or even pre-Homo sapiens. There is proof that our predecessors from our species also needed to somehow mark deaths and things like that. Anyway, the research into memorial art led me to wanting to share that with people in the public venues, and I started going to public libraries and presenting workshops where people could make collage. And I told people it can even be a tool for whatever it is you want to go home as your creative process. Because people are like, I'm not an artist. Then just look at this as, I don't know, as even what, but you can go and turn it into, you can go make a pot of soup for someone in their honor. And that's art to me. That's just art. And it's also ritual. If you have that person in mind and that's your intention, if the intention is there to honor the person, then it's ritual. But yeah, people that really enjoyed these memorial art workshops where we made the collage, and it allowed them to freely talk about the person who had died, who died 20 years ago. You get shut down just for those, because you've got the 3 days of bereavement and you're supposed to start showing up for work again. And people look, you're on some sort of timeline with people. It's they died 3 months ago, things like that. Those kinds of workshops were really wonderful. And I think a lot of people appreciated them.
I feel like we should explain what a diorama is,
Oh, what a
because
diorama
I
is.
know what it is.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
I'll just throw out that if people were to think of it, if they've been to a museum, or even especially a natural history museum, there'd be those three-dimensional scenes of animals or people, indigenous people, when they're live, how we do that in museums. And anyway, so three-dimensional scenes of, and they can be fiction, they can resemble something that was real. But yeah, so a diorama is a miniature form of a three-dimensional scene. And again, it can be something you completely make up, which is what I've done, or it'd be something that based on a photograph and you try to recreate that photograph. But you go from real life form and bring it all down. You can see like cityscapes. Cityscapes can be dioramas. You can go like to New York. I know New York, you can see all of Manhattan. And to me, that's a diorama because it's just these tiny little buildings showing you all the streets and everything. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah. And for the layperson, what you would do is you would get a shoebox, and then you would get maybe go to Michael's or, an art store, and you get little characters and, little trees or things like that. And you can, make a scene in there. Right. So if you're grieving someone and you used to love to go to a baseball game, you can make a little diorama of you guys at a baseball game and put all the fun. That was the hot dogs, and then that's the team that we used to watch and
go
things
wild.
Like that.
You go wild, and
it's really they're really fun to do too.
They're really cool. Fun to do, and yeah, shoeboxes I think are pretty common. I think they still occasionally I see elementary school shoebox dioramas posted somewhere, so I know it's happening somewhere still. It's still alive, the diorama world, but it is still alive. It's very vibrant, actually. There's a lot of incredible diorama work going on in the world these days. But does that make sense, Nasser? Did you know what a diorama was before?
Yeah, I've had some idea of it, but I didn't really think much of how it could be used for our kind of work. The way you describe it, it's definitely interesting. I do want to see it with my own eyes. So a picture, especially if any blog or any video that we're having on this topic, would be great.
Yeah, no, that'd be fun to make. Yeah.
Nasser, do you have any final questions?
What I really want to know is, do you think the whole idea of using the virtual space and virtual education that One Washcloth provides, do you think that this can really help impact the way people view death and grief? The virtual space and virtual education, things like BBG, what we do, blogs, videos, meetings, seminars.
Yes, I do. If people just need to be shown, oftentimes people know that they need something, they just don't know maybe how to access it. But if we have these models of people doing it, or where tools are being shown to how to approach things, it may not work for everybody, but it's going to work for a lot of people. It's going to help a lot of people. So yes, I do. I'm a big fan of Bounce Back Generation for everything you guys are doing. So yeah, I do think so. I think whatever we use whatever we've got to help get people some help and tools out there.
Yeah, the virtual space, we at BBG, we've discovered the virtual space is incredibly powerful. There's so much you can do with the virtual
You're opening
space.
my eyes to a lot of it. I'm coming from a nursing world where podcasts were
And
almost a
in
foreign
fact,
word.
it's actually really, I do not understand. The internet has been around for 20 years. Why isn't it everywhere? When cars were invented, 20 years later, people were flying across continents. I
Yeah,
mean, 40
but
years, not even like 50 something years after the plane, people were already on the moon. The internet is almost at a quarter century old. Why isn't it in healthcare? Why isn't it everywhere? Why isn't it?
I think we're learning how to use it still. And that's part of what we're doing is how can we use this in a really positive and fulfilling way, even though we all recognize that in person and touching someone is really important. But this is the second best way, right? So just to wrap it up, thank you so much, Susan. You've been fantastic. I feel like
no,
there's 50 more questions we could ask you. And I'm
yeah.
really glad that we're working together to bring some of your training and talk about One Washcloth. And we'll share more through this podcast, but also through our website, bbgtv.org, where we will include videos about how to do some of the ritual process and the grieving process, and we'll show some dioramas and collages, and it'll be really great. But one thing that we do at the end of every podcast is we really try to connect that idea that we are bounced back, which is about emotional resilience building. And then there's the generations, because we really try to understand how we influence each other generation to generation. There's generational trauma, but there's also generational support. So we always ask people at the end of our podcast, who made a difference for you when you were growing up?
I guess it'd be my grandparents. If I were really to have to choose people that were very involved with my childhood, or so minimally involved, really, but more than any other people. Yeah, my grandparents. They seem to offer that unconditional love, and just a place where I could go and be a kid and eat cookies, and just that break that a lot of us, I think, need, who come from homes that not necessarily ran smoothly. Yeah, I'd say from my younger age, younger years, it would have been my grandmother, especially on my father's side. Yeah.
That's great. And that helps us to show the building blocks for resilience and that relationship. So one of the building blocks is relationship. The other one is protection. So having a safe place where someone loves you and then is supportive of you. So that's confidence building. Maybe they taught you some coping skills, okay, how to stay calm or how to accept things. They gave you a place where you felt like you belonged. You're welcome there. And maybe storytelling, which is what we're doing now, having an opportunity to talk about how you feel and what happened to you.
Yeah.
So those relationships are so important. Thank you, Susan. This is great. And I'm glad that we're working together, and we'll have more to share with our followers.
Thank you, Jennifer and Nasser. This was really a joy for me.
Thank you
I look
so
forward.
much.
Yeah, look forward to our next connection.
Thanks for listening. Our producer is Liam Donaldson. Music by Jogging Turtle. Please subscribe to this podcast. It really helps us to grow. If you like the topics we discuss and would like to support our nonprofit, please visit bouncebackgeneration.org to learn more about us, and please consider donating to help us along.